Well, thank you, Tom Nagorski. And I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm president of the Asia Society Policy Institute here in New York. Welcome to you one and all. Particularly welcome to these two great guys who have been serious thinkers and performers in public policy and in diplomacy. Tom Donilon, we know, National Security Advisor under President Obama, and a formidable thinker, but a formidable practitioner of the complex diplomacy concerned with Asia's future in a period of turbulent change. And in the midst of the region itself, Ambassador Ashok Mirpuri, good friend of mine. We first met when he was Singaporean High Commissioner to Australia. And I was a junior woodchuck in the Australian Foreign Service as a lowly backbencher looking for a free meal on the Canberra diplomatic circuit. Yes. And so Ashok's chef looked after me as I pined away in distant Canberra. He's now the Singaporean ambassador in Washington, which of course is Singapore's preeminent diplomatic post abroad. The reason we've come together tonight is because, as the title of our report suggests, we've decided to step back for a moment from the immediacy of North Korea and ask the question, how on earth do we preserve the long peace, which we have seen in Asia since really the fall of Saigon, in terms of pan-regional conflicts, really, I suppose, since the end of the Korean War in '53, or in fact even back to '45 itself. Certainly since 1975, we've seen decades of regional geopolitical stability. Indochina itself wound down by about 78, 79. You had border wars with China, you had border wars with between Vietnam and Cambodia. But decades of, by and large, continuing geopolitical stability. And that created for us the underpinnings, the strategic underpinnings for the subsequent decades of extraordinary economic growth. And combined with what happened then domestically in China, with Deng Xiaoping's extraordinary program of domestic economic reform, reforming and marketizing the domestic economy, opening the Chinese economy to the outside world. And so we land at 2017, where, frankly, the world is changed as a result of the changes which have occurred in Asia. We now look to the global economy, and we ask ourselves the question, which we would never ask 4 decades ago, what's happening with Chinese growth rates, what's happening with Chinese interest rates, what's happening in terms of the reform of state-owned enterprises, because these matters are not just influential, but they are material and fundamental to the future of the global economy. China's slice of global trade, China's slice of global outbound investment, the role of Chinese capital markets, both on the upside and the downside. But beyond that, the broader, let's call it East Asian economic phenomenon as well. There's a danger in the business of international relations that those of us who look at it, those of us who have been practitioners, and those of us who are still practitioners, that we become preoccupied with the crisis of the moment. And it's not as if what's happening with the North Korean nuclear weapons program is some piece of marginalia. It's big. It is a phenomenon in its own terms. When you have a country which is crossing a threshold of being in possession of an ICBM, having a capacity, partially disputed, for militarization of nuclear weapons in order to place a nuclear warhead on one of those intercontinental ballistic missiles, and now with an accuracy and range to present for the first time a conceivable threat to the continental United States, this is no ordinary happening. And those of us in the Asia Society, led by myself and Danny Russell, our diplomat in residence, have been actively engaged week in, week out for months now on the North Korean nuclear question. And I'm sure Ambassador Mirpuri and Tom Donilon will have something to say about North Korea in itself. But at the same time, it causes us to think, what is the overall strategic trajectory for the Asia-Pacific region? The core of what we call often the Asian paradox is this: decades of sustained economic growth now underpinning global growth coming from Asia and the Asia-Pacific region more generally, yet at the same time a plethora of unresolved deep security conflicts within the same region. North Korea is just one of them, the divided peninsula left over from history and the events of 50 and 53. The East China Sea, if we had a seminar here 3 years ago, we would have been fretting and concerned about its future trajectory. Senkaku Diaoyudo. Taiwan Straits, those of us who followed the China business have been following the Taiwan Straits since the events of 49. And then we go to the South China Sea, momentarily out of the headlines, every month or so back in the headlines, when you have the conflicting positions of multiple nation states on the claim to its island spaces and the surrounding seas. But it doesn't stop there. In recent times also, very recent times, a resumption of border tensions to a high degree between India and China, and the hardy perennial, which is India, Pakistan, and the future of Kashmir. And so the great Asian paradox is so much sustained economic growth based on so much economic interaction and integration in terms of the flow of goods, services and capital, yet at the same time, all of this quietly festering away, which North Korea, in the most recent several months, has brought into the starkest focus. And that brings us to the question we set for ourselves as a team of former policy officials looking at, can we use regional institutions in the Asia-Pacific region to better manage these long-standing security tensions in the medium to long-term future, rather than just leave it either to the hazards of, let's call it, bilateral management between one country or another, or to the other hazards, which is the current and future state of China-US relations, wherever that may take us. In other words, is there a third role for regional institutions within the Asia-Pacific region to take the temperature down, to manage issues when they arise, even in the future to assist with dispute management and dispute resolution, and to build more broadly what might be called confidence and security building measures across the disparate states of wider East Asia and the wider Asia-Pacific region, around a concept of common security, the common challenges we face on the security front, rather than the security problems we have with each other. And that's where this exercise came from, which we entitled Preserving the Long Peace. Its subtitle is Institutional Building Blocks for Long-Term Regional Security. Now, that is a title bound to put it on the New York Times bestseller list. I've been guaranteed that by the publisher and the editor-in-chief. In fact, the same for the journal as well. It just rolls off the tongue. That was irony, Australian style. And the reason why it doesn't lend itself to a cute and glib little title is because it's a bloody complicated subject. But it's a really important one. So we got together as a team about 2 years ago, made up of Tom Donilon, former National Security Advisor to President Obama, but also Shiv Shankar Menon, former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India until the election of the Modi government, but also the former Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, Igor Ivanov, Madam Kawaguchi of Japan, the Foreign Minister during the time of Prime Minister Fukuda, not that many years back. Former Foreign Minister Kim Hwang-sun of South Korea. Wang Ji-se, a member of the Foreign Policy Board of the Chinese Foreign Ministry and probably one of China's most formidable, shall we say, academic commentators on China's role in the world. Together with Marty Natalegawa, the former Foreign Minister of Indonesia for about a 10-year period throughout the period of President Yudhoyono. And yours truly. My job was to supply the beer and the drinks and sometimes the aperitifs if it was all getting a bit rough. But amazingly, the document you've got before you, which, as I said, doesn't have a John le Carré bestseller title, we've managed to achieve agreement from those of us about the best way forward. And in 1 minute, I'll just summarise it in these terms. There's a bunch of institutions out there in the Asia-Pacific region. It's just like one huge alphabet soup. There's APEC, there's the ARF, there's the ASEAN +3, there's the ASEAN +6, there's this, there's SICA, there's the SCO, and there's even one called IORA. Here's a prize. Anyone know what IORA is? You don't get to put your hand up. Because you're a professional in the trade. It's the Indian Ocean Rim Association. So just put that one away for your next game of Trivial Pursuit. But you know something? There's none of these institutions which actually has a region-wide security mandate involving heads of government, able to discuss and debate the most fundamental questions of long-term regional security on a regional basis, with everybody around the table, not just the two bilaterals or the two countries which might have an issue at stake. So there's one which has a bit of potential. Kicked off 10 years ago. It's called the East Asian Summit. The members are the 10 members of ASEAN, the 3 Northeast Asians, that's China, South Korea, as well as Japan, the 3 add-ons, as we describe ourselves, India, Australia and New Zealand, and most recently the 2 grand add-ons, the United States and the Russian Federation. Let's call it the Gang of 18, because if you stick them all together, frankly, you're looking at most of the central players for the future of Asia-Pacific security. And the question is, can we take the fledgling mandate of this institution, called the East Asia Summit, and turn it into something much more robust for the future? And that's what this says in 50 pages with no pictures. There's a couple of coloured graphs for those of you who get bored with the text.
Nice chart. You should show everyone a chart. Yes.
Well, I should show you the chart, yes, which is not a bad chart. If you really want to impress people at your next Trivial Pursuit game, this is a very handy little chart which points out for you which regional organisations exist at present and which countries are members of each of them. And what you'll see from the alphabet soup, which then presents itself, is frankly nobody's in control of anything much. That, I think, is a recipe for disaster. So that's the pitch. That's what we're seeking to do. And the final recommendation is to the heads of government and the foreign ministers of this thing called the East Asia Summit, is have a look at this thing, and if you think there's enough merit in it, given that we have put together a team of people from unlikely countries, from Russia to China and to the United States, and from Japan and Australia and Indonesia, and others, to come up with what we think is a modest but practical set of proposals to take this institution into the future. That's what has been the subject of our work, and I'm very pleased, honoured and proud to be able to launch this here this evening. Our format this evening is I'm now going to ask Tom Donilon, as one of our co-commissioners for this report, to speak for 7 or 10 minutes on this and more broadly if he so chooses, followed by Ambassador Mirpuri, and then we'll have an open conversation through till about I think 7:30, am I right? Nod at me, please. Thank you. You don't know, you just nodded for fun. That's right. And then opening it to dialogue and questions from the audience, taking us through till about 8 this evening. So that's our discussion. Thank you all for being here tonight. We hope this is going to be a good, serious, focused policy discussion about how we preserve the long peace in Asia. Tom Donilon, over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be here again at the Asia Society with Ashok and with you, Kevin. Kevin did an amazing job putting this together because as he kind of quickly described to you the commissioners on that took on this project, they were formidable people from all over the world. And they were close to their governments, frankly, and understood the interests of their countries in the Asia region and represented those interests pretty forcefully. But we were able, I think, to come up with a consensus document here that's pretty powerful with respect to trying to find a solution to the problem that was set forth. And Kevin did a terrific job of recruiting such a terrific group of people and getting us to the product. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Kevin. With respect to the challenge, I think about Asia today. Kevin described it, I think, accurately in the phrase the Asian paradox. Obviously, tremendous economic and development in Asia over the course of over a half century, but developing now a series of trends which need addressing. Right, there's obviously an increase in nationalism in the region. There remain unresolved territorial claims throughout the region. Some of them coming lasting roots many years ago. Third, there's a deepening ideological competition, not just in Asia but globally right now between authoritarian approaches and the more liberal democratic approaches, which have been on the march and are in a bit of a retreat right now. It comes forth in the context of increased great power competition in the world. For the period from the fall of the Soviet Union until really Putin's comeback in the second time for the presidency in the spring of 2012, the great powers were engaged in, the large powers were engaged in pretty productive and constructive relationships. The comedy was kind of the rule of the road at that point, to great advantage, I think, in the world in terms of tackling global problems. With Putin's comeback in 2012, and the major events after his comeback, including the annexation of Crimea and the incursion into Ukraine most directly and manifestly, the great power relations right now are not on that track. I mean, Putin, the United States undertook an integration mode with respect to its foreign policy, with respect to both China and Russia. And Russia's rejected that integration approach, frankly. And at this point, I think you'd have to characterize Russia in a hostile posture towards the United States and towards the West. And there's more competition. It's not the same by any means with respect to China, but it's a more competitive setting, frankly, between the United States and China right now across the board. I think over the course, frankly, of the next couple of years, we'll be discussing a number of the economic issues, I think, that are at issue between the United States and China. But it's to be expected. And Xi Jinping, obviously, is a strong leader who's pursued a different posture in the world, frankly, for China. And it has resulted, I think, in more competition. So that's, I think, another characteristic of the region. And obviously, it's in the context, fifth, of China's historic rise, and last, in the context of discussions in the United States over the course of the last campaign about what the role of the United States is going to be in the world, and many questions being raised about the United States and its continued role with respect to leading the U.S. constructed and led post-World War II international order. All these things, I think, at issue are right now. So there's a real need here, I think, to look at mechanisms for trying to address some of these underlying problems, potential problems in Asia. Luckily, we had an existing institution, young as compared to a lot of institutions, as Kevin said, but nonetheless a constructed in a way that had most of the major players at the table, as Kevin laid out. The report recommends strengthening that institution operationally and in terms of agenda setting. It's quite consistent with the vision of the United States during the 2010-2011 when President Obama decided to participate at the head of state level at the East Asia Summit and to try to make it the premier diplomatic and security organization in Asia. That was the vision that President Obama had, and this report, I think, is quite consistent with that. Now, I remember the discussions about that. When you make a decision like that in the White House to have the president participate every year at the head of state level in a summit, that's a big commitment for a United States president. We had lots of questions in the White House, and particularly those who managed the time of the president, saying, "Why are we going to agree with this now? This institution is young. It's really not really developed very well. The agenda changes year to year. There's nobody really in charge. There's no secretariat." We by the way, recommend changing a lot of that in this report. And President Obama's response was, well, we can either complain about it, right, or we can go try to join it and do something about it. And that's what the United States undertook to do. And my recommendation to the current administration would be to take on that same attitude towards it. And I think President Trump is scheduled to attend the East Asia Summit meeting in Manila, right, in November during the course of his trip to Asia. So we have an organization that exists, and we think we can build on it towards quite positive ends, I think. So I think that the recommendations are quite sound. I wanted to spend a minute on North Korea, if I could.
By all means.
Yeah. So this is obviously turning out to be the premier test of the U.S.-China relationship right now, I think it's fair to say. We have a situation in North Korea with a first-class security challenge. It's emerged over the course of many years. What's happened, though, in the last couple of months is that it's become clear that across a number of dimensions, that the North Korean program is proceeding faster than most analysts expected it would. And that's what the confrontation is, I think, at this point, and why it's become such a prominent issue in Asia and again and globally. The administration's announced in a number of places essentially a peaceful pressure campaign is the way it was phrased in a Wall Street Journal piece written by Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis about 3 or 4 weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal. Basically a maximum pressure campaign, working principally with China, but with others around the world in terms of pressuring the North Koreans to get on a path towards resolution of the issue. I think that pressure campaign should be accelerated. And I think we have a model, and the model is essentially is the Iran pressure campaign that was run in the period between 2000, between the Bush 43 administration and the Obama administration over the course of several years, in terms of really presenting regime-threatening levels of pressure against, in that case, Iran, to bring them to the table to seek a negotiated. And I think we should be accelerating that pressure. There's a flaw here in a lot of the discussion, which is that kind of an all or nothing, right? And that's the critique of the Iran deal, by the way. Basically, well, we have this transactional arms control deal with Iran, but it doesn't solve the problem that Iran is still a malign force in the world, still a principal source of terrorism in the world. That's not the purpose in toto of an arms control deal, and we shouldn't throw away this concept that you can address through arms control and transactional deals stability and security and establish some more channels for discussion. And all or nothing won't get you where you want to go, I think, at the end of the day. And I think the Iran model is applicable in the North Korea circumstance, and we should seek to pursue it. My own view would be specifically on North Korea that the United States should appoint an envoy for dealing with the allies in Northeast Asia right now. I don't think there's enough attention being paid. I think, as I said, we should accelerate and put in place a regime-threatening sanctions if we can. And that would include, by the way, secondary sanctions with respect to China and its financial institutions. Now, China took a step today, which was interesting, which was to essentially look at Chinese institutions, financial banking institutions, and say that new accounts, North Korean-related new accounts can't be opened. In some cases, close old accounts, which is an important step forward. And I think they're probably trying to get ahead of what might be U.S. secondary sanctions. We need additional missile defense assets in the region, additional military assets generally, and we need a deep dialogue with China about various scenarios. It is at the beginning of that section of my talk. It really is kind of an acid test of the U.S.-China relationship going forward. Thanks, Kevin.
Very good comments, Tom. It's very interesting if you put into context the current debate over North Korea. And the debate we had with full firepower in the last couple of years here in the United States over the Iran nuclear deal. And then casting our mind back in history to what happened in the beginning of arms control negotiations between the United States and then Soviet Union. And the key thing with all three questions is know the parameters of your discussion. Arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union did not end the Cold War. In fact, they preceded some of its ugliest times, if we remember the history between the early 70s and what transpired through until 89 and 91. Yeah. And hence your point just now about Iran as well.
Yeah. This is a really important point, I think, though, on kind of the arms control transactional elements here, which are not to be dismissed, right? When No one thought that the SALT negotiations with respect to the Soviet Union was going to change the nature of the system, but it did bring stability and a measure of security.
And but actually then tying all that back to where some of the arms control and related processes then went to between the United States and the Soviet Union, they did, in part, achieve further momentum through what became the Helsinki process. The Helsinki process also came out of what was called the CSCE, the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe. No one thought that was possible back in 1975, as you just had Europe divided between East and West, US allies and Soviet allies, and that was the end, until we were able to get our minds together through a pan-regional conference, what became a pan-regional association coming out of the events of 75. And the rest, as they say, is history. So back to the region and back to the future of the East Asian Summit. Singapore has been so much at the absolute centre of the regional debate on the future of regional architecture, going back to the earliest days and the successful foundation of ASEAN half a century ago. And where ASEAN has gone to since then has been this overwhelmingly stabilising institution. Think back, the original 5 members of ASEAN in 1967, and part of its strategic rationale then forming this regional bulwark against the inevitable onward march of Southeast Asian communism. Now, ASEAN 10 members includes all said communist states as they then existed, most particularly Vietnam, but also what subsequently evolved with Cambodia and with Laos as well. And now, instead of replicating those sort of deep security divides, that institution, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, basically has brought about a sense of common regional security community among the 10. But the challenge is, can you take the ASEAN model more broadly across the wider Asia-Pacific region and use it as something similar to, shall I say, take the edge off and manage better the security tensions across the wider region as well, not just the Southeast Asian 10. And hence we saw the evolution of firstly ASEAN plus 3, including the 3 Northeast Asians, then ASEAN plus 6, which then became the East Asia Summit, including India and the others, and now the East Asian Summit, including the Russian Federation and the United States itself. So Ashok, you've been in the midst of all of that, formidable intellect and formerly the head of policy planning in the Singaporean Foreign Ministry, senior diplomatic appointments. Your reflections on the report and where to in terms of broader East Asian regionalism.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. And I'm very honored to be here on the panel with Mr. Donilon and Mr. Rudd. And I may have spotted Kevin Rudd as a young backbencher in the Australian Parliament and occasionally invited him over for meals. But, you know, look at where his career went, and I'm still an ambassador only. So,
yours is more predictable, my friend. Yours is like that.
But Kevin's always been forward-looking on where the regional architecture has to go. I would dispute some of the very positive comments about ASEAN, because I don't think that ASEAN has really achieved as much as we had hoped it would be able to achieve 50 years on. It's done a good job. But more importantly, when you address this issue of the long peace that the report points to, I think the one fundamental element that we have to be very conscious about has been the very, very critical role of the United States. The post-World War II role that the U.S. played in the Asia-Pacific has brought us through this period of the long peace. And that's where I think we have to understand, how do you manage to maintain this role at a time when there are global changes and regional changes, and when there's a lot of questioning in the U.S. as well about the value of that engagement in the Asia-Pacific. So I think that's where we have to start addressing some of these issues that go beyond the regional architecture of how do we keep that long peace going. Because every structure that you see today has had in it a strong U.S. component to it. whether it was ASEAN 50 years ago, the 5 non-communist countries that were there against Southeast Asia communism. The US was fighting the war in Vietnam, whether it was subsequent types of elements of regional architecture. And aside from the East Asia Summit, there are things like the ASEAN Regional Forum that started in the early 1990s. Australia, the US were very active members of that. Whether you look at things like the ADMM+, which has emerged as another structure of that regional architecture, and regular meetings of the ASEAN defense ministers with their 8 counterparts who sort of are in the EAS, but also meetings where the ASEAN defense ministers travel out to the United States and China. The US role has been quite fundamental in that. And that's where I think that the ASEAN agenda and priority is, how do you keep a US strategic engagement in the region at a time when there are regional dynamic changes? And the most significant dynamic change has been the emergence of China. And the emergence of China has been a significant plus to the Asia-Pacific region. I have no doubt about that. First, the ability of China to bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and then to engage with the region economically. Today, if you look at the trading relationships of all the Southeast Asian countries, China is their #1 trading partner. The US, that used to be the #1 trading partner of most of these countries, is now 4 or 5. With Singapore, I think the US is now #4. With some of the others, it's gone even lower down. These shifts are starting to emerge, where China has become a very significant player in the region. China is a geographical part of the region. The US, even though many of us see the US as a resident power in the Asia-Pacific, still has to traverse an ocean to come across to the Asia-Pacific. How does this balance work itself out? And we have been speaking earlier about this US-China dynamic. We see it today in the whole North Korea issue. But this dynamic is going to permeate every conversation about East Asia, whether it is trade, whether it is economic relationships, whether it is the US pulling out of TPP and China proceeding with One Belt, One Road, shaping a new strategic dynamic around there. How do we get both parties to engage themselves in a constructive way that the rest of the region can then take their direction and adjust themselves depending on where US-China relations end up sitting? But aside from this sort of US-China relationship, which is so fundamental to how the EAS is going to emerge, there is also the role of ASEAN. And one thing that has, I think, people sometimes overestimate the role of ASEAN, but without recognizing that the reason why ASEAN is successful, if I put that in quotes, is actually because ASEAN is not a strong organization. It is the most neutral place that you can do so many of these things. If we try to do some of these things outside the ASEAN context, because ASEAN, as Kevin described it now, 5 countries that came together 50 years ago against Southeast Asian communism, Brunei joined about 20 years later, and then came the other 4. It's a mix of countries, ideologies. What is the common factor that pulls ASEAN together? Very different from what pulls the EU together, because EU has got certain concepts of democracy and others like that. Very different from even the OSCE, where you had to have a war in Europe in order to pull things together. ASEAN is these 10 almost unwieldy countries that come across a range of ethnicities, a range of religions, a range of different political systems. You have monarchies, you have liberal democracies, you have military governments, each one trying to work together. So it's actually ASEAN's weakness sometimes that adds to its ability to sit around a table and pull everyone together. To convince everyone, it is unique, and Tom was speaking about the decision to have the US president attend the East Asia Summit every year. It is unique that the US president decides that he wants to attend this meeting of this grouping of 10 countries. Because The United States sees that as part of that strategic engagement. And the value that when President Obama, having started engaging with ASEAN in 2011 and annually attending the meetings, you saw the value of that about a year ago when he invited the ASEAN leaders to Sunnylands, where they sat around in a small group without staff to have an engagement. This didn't happen overnight. It is not an easy thing to have leaders sit around without staffs and engage with each other. It was the effort, it was the time and effort of the United States and the US president personally going out to the region every year, getting to know his counterparts, and then inviting them to the US to visit. And we hope that that will continue, that the current administration, as they are developing their Asia policy, will shape it in this direction, but also understanding this idea of ASEAN. ASEAN keeps this phrase all the time, and you'll see it in reports and everything, of ASEAN centrality. And that's really where we see the EAS developing. The EAS being pulled in a direction that the 10 ASEAN countries are most comfortable with. Because if the 10 ASEAN countries are most comfortable with it, then you know the partners are comfortable with it because we have taken everyone's interests into account. The EAS started in 2005. In 2015, the ASEAN, recognizing that it was not working as well as it did a review, a 10-yearly review, and came out with a KL declaration of the EAS, and we're now implementing elements of that. It has some elements that I think that the report also takes on, but the report builds on it a lot more actively. It's the ideas of an EAS secretariat. The idea among the ASEAN countries was to put an EAS unit as part of the ASEAN secretariat, not to create too much structures. But also important things, when the leaders meet, how do you follow up on conversations around there? I think we have not quite worked out how do you follow up on ideas like that. And then one element that, again, I would disagree with Kevin is this idea of the alphabet soup. The reason why we have an alphabet soup, that wonderful chart you have in your report, is that because in each organization, people see what they want to have. Whether it's EAS or ARF, for example, we do not have North Korea in the EAS. And then you can have the leaders discuss it. But we do have North Korea in the ARF. And each organization does have a space. And I would be reluctant to try and put this entire alphabet soup together and try and get something neat that comes out of it. I think the regional architecture has to be a little bit ambiguous. The regional architecture has to be a little bit messy because the region itself is messy. And there are elements in there that we want to maintain. Now, to add on to all this complexity as we go forward and as we try and implement some elements of the report and elements of what ASEAN wants, there are new areas of complexity emerging. We have spoken about some of the traditional national security type concerns, whether nationalism, whether North Korea, whether great power conflict. But we are dealing with new areas like cybersecurity and terrorism. We see a rise of Islamic terrorism entering the region, coming over from the Middle East. We see new challenges of cybersecurity. We have to find a way to have these discussed within the regional architecture as well. Otherwise, we will find that we are being left behind, speaking about old world type conflicts, which we are still conscious about, while new types of conflicts that do not have state actors necessarily, that have non-state actors operating in there functioning. So I think that the report has been very helpful. I enjoyed reading it. But I think that we need to look and say, how can we build on this and work around the current institutions to make it functional? Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok. And as you can see from those comments, a person who is not just a practitioner, but also an analyst and a thought leader on the question of Southeast Asian and broader East Asian institutionalism. Let's just take a few of those points for further conversation before we turn to questions from the audience. I've listened carefully to the presentations as you've neatly catalogued a wider region subject now to a series of simultaneously unfolding large changes. The emergence of China, on which we've conducted 1,000 seminars. But now a China which is frankly economically dominant across East Asia in a way in which we've never seen before. We also see China evolving its own institutions. Shanghai Cooperation Conference, organization, what is called SICA, and institutions which have about them a set of norms which are a little different. And then you have, of course, the new and emerging Chinese economic structures, which the ambassador referred to as well. You've got One Belt, One Road, now called the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, Idai Lu, but also what took the headlines only a few years ago, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and then there's the New Development Bank or the BRICS Bank, all outside US structures, all outside UN or Bretton Woods structures. So my overall point there being is that you have a whole series of, shall we say, regional phenomena which have their centre of gravity in Beijing. Then you've got this question about what's unfolding with the United States. A very elegant pattern of regional engagement from the Obama decision advised by Tom Donilon, join the institution, become more fully integrated. Ashok's earlier reminder that there wasn't such a thing as a strategic vacuum in East Asia post-45. It was the United States, which actually underpinned a lot of the, well, frankly, the core elements of stability and predictability, and therefore prosperity in wider East Asia. But now an open question mark under an America First presidency, and its predilection for protectionism, its predilection for bilateralism, its question mark even over alliances. And therefore an open question, despite commitments by the current president, as to whether he will be at the next East Asian Summit and whether he will be there for APEC. We hope he will be, to continue a good precedent established by President Obama. The new fragility of US-China relations, as things start to tear at the fabric more than we've seen before. And I think the elegant phrase used by Tom, which is that we now have the acid test of the North Korean nuclear program. But already fractures emerging around the South China Sea and elsewhere as well. And so the question which we come to, Ashok and Tom, is therefore, given all of the above and the new developments of China more active, the United States question mark maybe less active in the region, plus the fragilities of the relationship between the two of them, where does the rest of the region now go? And so the point about, let's call it the variable geometry of all these different regional institutions, is a useful one, and it's a good corrective of Ashok when he responded to my comment about alphabet soup. But to go back on that again, Ashok, and to invite comment from both of you, is that none of these institutions so far is contributing, I think, to, shall we say, ameliorating the new frictions that we see between China and the United States. And can we use the East Asia Summit with a more robust security agenda with multiple participants in the future to take the temperature of that relationship down so that everything is not at the end of the day just bilateralized between Washington and Beijing, but regional views about what counts for the stability of Southeast Asia, the future interests of India, as well as Japan and Korea are taken equally into account. So given all the diversity of ASEAN, which I think is huge, and you said before, a diffuse organisation, different political traditions, so too with the East Asia Summit. So can we take, shall I say, that diversity and turn it into an advantage pan-regionally to deal with these core tensions between China and the US, or is that asking too much?
Yeah.
Same question to you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ashok.
I wish I could be more optimistic, but in a sense,
You could try.
you know me long enough, I think we may start at a very lowest common denominator sort of approach. because the way these organizations are structured, including the EAS, it's a consensus-driven organization. And consensus-driven means you come down to what the least comfortable is comfortable with. And that's the way they've been structured. There is that least comfortable essentially has veto power on the agenda. And I want the EAS at best at least to create rules and structures that people can operate within first. Once you create the rules and structures and put a spotlight on people's actions and behaviors, that if leaders have to turn up at the annual summit and some of the actions they've taken in the course of the year are then questioned by their fellow colleagues or by others, then maybe it will hold them back. But to us, the organization, then to sit around, 18 of us, and it's a successful organization because people are knocking on the door to get in. The EU wants to get in. Canada wants to get in. It's a sign of the success of the organization. But to ask the 18 to sit over there and say, you know, we have views on US-China relations, can you guys fix it? I think maybe a little bit difficult. It's a lot easier to have the conversations on the side of the EAS because you have the 18 leaders. For the Australian Prime Minister to pull his Chinese colleague or his American colleague and say, we have some concerns about this and these are our concerns. Similarly, for the Indonesian president to raise it with his colleague. But for the 18 to sit around and do that, I think maybe putting too much on the agenda that goes beyond just creating the right structures for cooperation.
Yeah,
well put.
Kevin, my response would be this: is that I think it's not really on for these organizations to address kind of the core U.S.-China relationship set of issues. But as we say in the report, though, developing habits of cooperation with respect to low-hanging fruit is a phrase we use here on maritime issues, on disaster relief, on planning, on cyber. Things like that is really important, I think, because you start with the things that you can get a consensus on, that you can put together operational capabilities to handle, and you build from there. And I think that's, as we recommend here, I think that's the way to go with respect to the development of the organization. And it does provide a forum for, and I really hope the U.S. president continues to participate. It does provide a forum and an opportunity for conversation to take place about broader issues, but the precise operating goals of the organization, I think, should be focused on things that can get done and you can build on. Now, some of the things are very important, obviously, which would include trying to get to codes of conduct and things like that for the South China Sea, which are fundamental kinds of things. But you can build up to these things. On the broader point, though, on the region, again, I don't think that that's putting too much on the organization. I think, but the fundamental point the ambassador made about the necessity of U.S. presence and reasserting the commitment is really critical. Each of the things that I laid out with respect to the dynamics that are there from nationalism, through the historic rise of China, every one of those issues will go less well absent U.S. presence. Every single one of them. And they will go better with U.S. presence. And indeed, we have a 70-year experiment on this, right? Where in fact Asia's prosperity and development, obviously principally due to the hard work and vision of Asian leaders and Asian people, but it has been built on the platform put together by the United States. And to pull that out at this time, right, would be a really serious strategic error by the United States with tremendous consequences. So reassertion, recommitment to allies. I think two other things, and I'll pick up from a U.S. perspective, which of course is the perspective that I am biased towards. More attention to Southeast Asia by the United States. And we've had a tremendous amount of attention, obviously, because I said it was a first-class security problem in Northeast Asia and North Korea. But taking our eye off the relationships we've built, the 600 million people, the large markets, the important dynamics on democracy and other things in Southeast Asia right now would be another mistake. And last, the withdrawal of the United States from the TPP was a first-class strategic mistake. And revisiting that, I think, asking the question, if it's not going to be the TPP as it was negotiated, what are the things in the agreement that could use addressing, right? Instead of kind of a full-fledged pullback. What's ironic, and I'll finish up on this, is that, of course, in the NAFTA negotiations, which are underway right now by the Trump administration, which I think in the first couple of rounds have actually gone pretty well, with respect to addressing the things that haven't been addressed since the mid-90s when the agreement was adopted, what's happening is the negotiating parties, including the United States, are importing elements of the TPP into the NAFTA negotiation in order to try to get to a decent place. So, a big strategic error. But the point I make is, I think don't put on the institution things that it can't handle. There are lots of things it can handle, but the fundamental really is the U.S. recommitment to its presence, because each of these dynamics will go less well if we don't.
Can I say something on TPP?
Yeah, by all means.
You know, I spent last year watching the U.S. election campaign, as most of you would have done. Trade had become a very difficult issue for both political parties. I think that's the reality of it. And while we speak of TPP, I feel that strategic loss of the U.S. stepping back from TPP. I think we also have to recognize that this was a very difficult domestic issue for the United States that needs to be addressed in some fashion or other. So I want to be able to recreate that strategic economic engagement in some fashion, but I think that so much has to be done here domestically to address the unhappiness that was here, that there was this sense, and maybe we didn't sell it actively enough, about going beyond the strategic value of it, what it meant for people's job, what it meant for regional supply chains that meant that prices went down. We never quite sold it in that fashion. And by keeping it at that high-level engagement, I think that we lost the ground on TPP. So today we are going here with something called TPP 11, minus the U.S. But we want to create a framework where hopefully the U.S. will find an engagement with the region again that is good for U.S. businesses, that Americans can feel is beneficial for them in the future, and then build on that, the strategic engagement.
I think that's right. If I could comment on this. As you know, I spent a lot of time, as you know, Ambassador, on the TPP negotiations and conceiving the TPP, and it was a strategic error. But the single most important national security strength, an element of the United States, is its economic strength, and we need to have a laser focus on that, because absent that, no nation can pursue the kinds of responsibilities that the United States has in the world. And so I think you're right that this is not the topic of this discussion, but in terms of thinking about the U.S. ability to conduct itself in the world from a position of strength. Economic strength is absolutely key, and the core there is addressing, Ambassador, what you referenced, which is a feeling, and it's not just a feeling, it's a reality at the center of our country that in fact the economy is not working for them, and the globalization is not working for them, and the future of work, it seems, uncertain. This is the fundamental strategic national security challenge, I think, that the United States has going forward.
And as we know full well in this room, I mean, the ultimate untruth of the argument, which is that sense of insecurity in Middle America derives from trade, as opposed to deriving from the ravages of technology and the advantages of technology, about to be compounded by what we call blithely artificial intelligence. Before we just
we have almost no discussion going on in the United States around that. We have a lot of discussion around trade, and I think, Lou Cade and others here have studied this carefully. The statistics, I don't know, some of the stuff I've seen at 80-20 maybe in terms of employment impact, 80% technology and automation. And so we have a lot of discussion about trade, and that needs to be addressed. But we have almost no discussion currently in the United States about policy steps that we can take to address the future of work at a time dramatically changing technology.
Just as we go to questions from the audience, both of you have hinted at this on the question of the United States. But if you take together what's happened on the TPP, folks like yourself, the Ambassador, myself in office, gung-ho on TPP. Why? Economics is fundamental, strength of the American economy, keep the United States central to the future core business of the region, US economic strength, and therefore core national strength lying in that proposition. Then you get the U-turn on TPP, some ambiguity on other questions. And so here's the question for both of you is, coming from the region, I already get the sense each time I go out to the neighbourhood that folks in the neighbourhood are already making some judgments. And the judgments are that Uncle Sam is slowly sliding back to the North American continent in one form or another. And as we often say in both physics and international relations, nature abhors a vacuum, and in international relations there ain't any such thing as a vacuum. That states are therefore beginning to calibrate their position. And therefore you begin to see the early movement of states not just opening themselves to the internal question about the future of the United States as a reliable economic and strategic partner, but actually saying, even post a Trump administration, will this now be so much part of the domestic discourse? Ashok's point that trade has been a hugely difficult sell domestically for both Democrats and Republicans. That we are in a period of serious, shall I call it, continental drift. And that's not just therefore going to leave the region suspended on ice for another 3.5 years. They'll start to make other calculations. Bit of a sensitive question, but I thought I'd throw it at you anyway.
You know, I think it is too soon to say. All administrations, and this is the second administration I'm working with, all administrations start with a domestic focus. The Obama administration started the first few years. Healthcare was a key priority.
And recovery from the...
recovering from the financial crisis.
Yeah.
You had that as you took office in early 2009. All administrations have to start from a domestic, because that's what elects presidents. That's what elects administrations. So it is too early to say, and it would have been unrealistic for anyone in the region, and I speak to people in the region, to have expected a broad Asia strategy by President Trump's administration in the first year. I think the first year agenda is just show up. And once you show up, and when you work with Asia, showing up is
it was
already...
that easy in Australia, mate. Just show up, open the door. And you
Yeah, well, you show up in the region, I think it's good. And the fact that President Trump, or when Vice President Pence was in Jakarta in April, he announced that President Trump will go out to the East Asia Summit in the APEC. You never announce visits 6 months in advance. But I think they must have sensed that there was some uncertainty in the region about the president's engagement with Asia. That Vice President Pence, when he was at the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, said the president will come. And that is, showing up is, I think, the first step. Showing up and then listening to people and getting the views. And then as we go into 2018 and 2019, then I think we'll start to see some elements of that agenda, the strategy start to emerge. But I think the region is a little bit more patient. The changing dynamic is the different economic pulls happening in the region. I think that the loss of TPP is one thing, but even then, I think we can recreate some sort of economic engagement for the United States, even if it is putting together the bilaterals into a bigger multilateral. Australia has an FTA with the US. Singapore has an FTA with the US. We can take some of these things, and how can we build a larger structure that's not called TPP? But let them show up, let them listen, and then let's take it from there. So I would be hesitant to sort of say we write off the United States at any point.
Yeah. There's no reason for it to be written off. If you do a careful net assessment of the United States versus its potential competitors into the next century, the United States will likely be the most prominent country in the world for a long time. But there's no reason for the vacuum to be created. But the vacuum will be filled. There's no doubt about that in my mind, and we see it every day in Asia. So it behooves the United States to be present, but also to pursue a multidimensional strategy in Asia, and I have to say, and not to do things that in any way undermine the confidence of our allies and friends in the region during the course of this initial part of the administration. That is important. So things like a precipitous withdrawal from the U.S.-Korea trade agreement, unnecessary conflict with allies during the course of the North Korea crisis. These things need to be paid careful attention to because countries obviously over the course of, we're 8 months in now, 7 months in, countries will make decisions going forward. So it behooves the United States, I think, to articulate its intentions and to demonstrate it.
Just if I can add one more thing, Kevin. I mean, sure. If I had one criticism of the Obama administration on the engagement with Asia, was the freedom of navigation operations. Yeah. On again, off again. We were never quite sure it was held within a context of U.S.-China relations. And I think that the fact that this administration has gone out there and said we will now have a regular schedule of freedom of navigation operations means that they will be present and engaged in the region, and not letting it slide, whether it was trying to negotiate climate change or something else with the Chinese, and saying we're going to be there, this is our presence, and we will stay active and present. So I think that each administration will have to find its own balance. Yeah. And then the countries of the region will look at it and say, let's take our direction from there. Yeah.
I agree on the regularizing the freedom of navigation operations.
That's a good corrective point, Ashok. Thank you for raising it. Over to you now, folks, for some questions. Remember, our focus here is regional institutions. Tom's just spoken about a multi-layered American engagement with the region. One of those includes regional diplomacy and regional institutions. But Ashok has also cautioned us about shall we say, having an excessively ambitious agenda for such institutions. The fact that they exist, good. The fact that leaders regularly meet, good, because historically they didn't in any form of multilateral engagement. And thirdly, some of the low-hanging fruit, which is now becoming serious low-hanging fruit, cyber, counter-terrorism, not just natural disasters, plus, and maybe developing habits, as we say in the report, habits of consultation and dialogue about common security challenges, changing the culture over time, taking a leaf out of ASEAN's book. Questions from the audience on that and related subjects? I've never seen such a quiet audience here in my life. People are being shy. I'll take the gentleman in the middle up the back. That's you with the glasses, sir. Yeah, we're going to bring that. Then I'm going to go to the other three folk who've put their hands up.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much for the briefing. I kind of wanted to ask about the Rohingya of Myanmar, but I'll frame it in a way that covers what Mr. Rudd wanted. So if you did have an international organization, a regional organization that was working effectively, what would that do with major Asian crises, such as the ones we're faced with at the moment, the Rohingya in Myanmar and the North Korean nuclear crisis?
Well, let me throw a thought back at that, given that the Rohingya are not a specific subject for us this evening. But let's go back to something which regional institutions have responded to in the past. Let's go to the Indo-Chinese refugees crisis of the 1970s. Big challenge for the region. Different responses on the part of regional states, including Malaysia at the time and in Singapore. But in time, what you did see was the evolution of a response which dealt with the problem comprehensively, aided by the regional institution ASEAN. It's difficult to project ahead what would be done in relation to the Rohingya. I think what you could say about ASEAN more generally is its policy of, shall I say, patient engagement with the former military regime of Myanmar/Burma, in the long term helped to pay dividends in terms of gradual political transformation within the country more generally. And of course there are tensions now between Aung San Suu Kyi on the one hand, who has been on this platform not long ago, secondly the Burmese military, who still have powers under the constitution to resume political control of the country if there are perceived threats to national security, in which category they may place what's going on in the Rakhine state against the human rights abuses which are plainly occurring there and which need to be dealt with. On the North Korean question, I think regional institutions at present would see that as way beyond their current pay grade. I'm just making a broad observation. For the simple reason is that you are dealing with the absolute most fundamental question of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, ICBMs, threats to the continental United States. I suppose our point through this report is it would help in developing common cultures of security policy engagement with countries even like North Korea, if you had a platform for regional dialogue over a long period of time. Can I go to this question?
On that,
sure.
though, I could see, I think there would be a role, frankly, if in fact the organization were seen as a premier security and political and diplomatic organization, in terms of a universal regional statement with respect to the unacceptability of North Korea's behavior in violation of a myriad of UN Security Council resolutions. Concrete things like agreement on prohibiting illicit trade, agreement not to have labor from North Korea come in and come back and forth and send remittances back, sanctions enforcement generally, maybe participation and interdiction efforts. I think there are a number of things, if you had a functioning organization, frankly, that you could do that would be supportive of a resolution of the Korea situation.
So what Tom's referring to there is normative positions taken by a regional institution, which at present, by and large, don't occur on big pan-regional security questions.
Well, you have had the ASEAN foreign ministers issue statements about the North Korea situation. After the missile tests and others, the ASEAN foreign ministers did issue a statement. But that's really the best that you can achieve, and you are then sending a signal to the North Koreans that some of this behavior is unacceptable. The North Koreans do attend the ASEAN Regional Forum. It's an opportunity for people to say that this is not acceptable to us. But then to go beyond that and say we're going to sort of interfere, it is, as Kevin says, it's really too big a problem for the 10 Southeast Asian countries to be able to do. And even within the EAS, how do we manage this? On the Myanmar question, ASEAN has been successful because of this idea of non-interference in domestic issues. And this is really seen as something that is domestic. But we have offered that ASEAN is available for quiet help on these things. Some of these things do not necessarily have to take place in public. But I think the idea of non-interference is why ASEAN has been able to survive so well for over 50 years with all the diversities that we have.
I'm going to take three questions. A gentleman at the front here, a gentleman there with the white jacket, and I saw someone's hand up here as well. Yes, the lady at the back as well. So those three, if that's okay, starting with this gentleman here.
Hi. The idea of an EAS secretariat, can you talk a little about how you would give that heft and some ballast relative to, say, the current ASEAN secretariat?
Good. Gentleman here. This gentleman here with the white jacket.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You're going to answer his?
No, we're going to go ask for three and then we're going to
okay.
throw
Mine
it back.
It's just a quick statement that I lived in Singapore for a number of years, and I never saw us being in Southeast Asia very important to the growth or anything else that I can think of. For example, in 1880, the in and out trade and entrepreneurial trade of Singapore was 23% of that of the Port of New York, and we had no real influence on the confrontation problem when I was living there. It was all done by Singapore and the Brits bankrupting the country. That's what they did in Indonesia. So I don't see us reasserting. We were never there as importantly as I get you people feel.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Question of history, question of the future. Lady at the back there.
Hi, thank you for the great sharing. I'm just wondering, in terms of institution region, are you talking about China, mainland China and Hong Kong as a whole or different part?
Okay, that's an interesting question of...
I noticed something interesting things on the page of 2021, the figure 1. Well, the China and Hong Kong was mentioned separately. So I don't know why it's a habit thing or mistake or...
No, I think without looking at the reference, Hong Kong and Taiwan, for example, are included as economies which are members of APEC, and that's been the case since the beginning, and as regional economic entities have routinely been treated as such with the full support of Beijing. And Hong Kong has its own general personality. So let's take those three sets of... Well, let's leave that to one side. Let's go to the two questions which have been raised. Is there a future credible role for an enhanced ASEAN Secretariat, and what would it look like? And the broader question of, shall I say, history, which has been raised by the gentleman concerning Singapore and the United States, and how Singapore, according to your view, sir, is therefore ultimately irrelevant to the United States. I think there'll be a different view here.
So the US is irrelevant to Singapore.
Sorry, back the other way.
The EAS Secretariat, because
Yeah.
ASEAN's idea is an EAS unit within the ASEAN Secretariat.
Yeah.
So we want to put it in there so you can still keep that ASEAN centrality. But the report came out with the EAS Secretariat. So I want to ask a question. What was your thinking around that idea?
The thinking around that idea on the part of the independent commissioners was that for the EAS itself as an institution to have more shape and focus in the future, it cannot simply be entrusted to the national chairmanships of each country which happens to be chairman of ASEAN and therefore the EAS for that particular year. In other words, if you're going to have an institutional memory about what transpired in a conversation among the EAS heads of government in one year, then in fact that needs to be translated systemically, not just haphazardly from one country throwing a football to the next one. That's the whole argument about Secretariat's period, as you know, Ashok, whether it's for the G20 at one level or whether it's for ASEAN within your own business, hence the ASEAN Secretariat, and potentially for the EAS, given it involves, frankly, almost as many countries beyond the ASEAN 10 as the ASEAN 10 themselves. That's on the Secretariat question. Do you have a comment on the history point?
Let me just add to the second, how ASEAN sees it. ASEAN's been very careful about some of the institutionalized elements. The ASEAN Secretariat does not follow the chairmanship of ASEAN. The ASEAN chair rotates annually. The ASEAN the ASEAN Secretariat actually has a 5-year rotating Secretary General. So the current Secretary General is Vietnamese, and then the turn will go on next to Brunei, and they appoint people of some significance into these roles. It used to be, so since the charter, the ASEAN Charter, they now have a much more professionalized secretariat. But with it, we see putting the EAS unit into that to meet that, to address the issue of continuity, of following up on decisions, leaders' decisions, as part of that unit, because we still see ASEAN as central to EAS, rather than the EAS creating an identity separate from ASEAN. So that's where I think the ASEAN KL Declaration of 2015 sees it, whereas I think that your idea may be a little bit more sort of independence from that ASEAN role. And in both cases, you still want to have that question of some follow-up. Leaders meet every year. Who is going to keep track of decisions? Who's going to follow up? Now, whether you do it in a larger sector or do it within the ASEAN framework, I think it's just a matter of how you can fund these things and keep it going.
Good. Any thoughts on these questions? On the Singapore history question?
The US has been fundamental to Singapore's success over the past 50 years. So I would not we have a free trade agreement. It was the first Asian country that the US did a free trade agreement with over 10 years ago. It's successful for the US because the US actually has a surplus with Singapore. And for Singapore, what we have seen in our development in the post-1960s, you left in Confrontasi, which was 65, 66. In the post-65 time, U.S. companies investing in Singapore. Yeah. And today.
I'm saying historically, before 50 years, we got too much in Singapore. We weren't even there.
You know, actually, the first time, the first relationships, the former U.S. ambassador to Singapore, remind me of another former U.S. ambassador here, David Edelman, was an ice trader, bringing ice to Singapore. I think the trading relationships continued, but particularly since 1965, particularly when people like you took a bet on Singapore.
No, we put in 1939.
Then even earlier, before the World War, before the Second World War. But today you see your global multinationals from the U.S. in particular. Singapore's become the regional hub for U.S. investments.
Yeah, I think we've got your historical point, sir.
Yeah.
I think we do have your historical point, just as there is another historical point that the sun did set on the British Empire. And that left a whole lot of things, shall I say, up in the air, for which there are a range of regional responses, some of which was independence for various states, others of us having to take our own futures into our own hands, and others a greater role for the United States as the British withdrew to west of Suez and then eventually west of La Manche. Before they ended up in Wales.
It's a bigger,
which is kind of where they're up to at the moment.
Yeah, it's a bigger issue than when a U.S. facility or company might have been there. These are issues of balance and confidence, and as the ambassador referenced, freedom of navigation, and a platform on which kind of Asian development and economics have been built.
Yeah, I think that's true. By the way, on the question of the chart you referred to up the back before, The reason why Hong Kong and Taiwan are referred to separately is because they're separate entities within APEC. And that's how APEC was conceived at the outset with full support of the Chinese government.
This is a tough crowd.
Yeah, it is a tough crowd. So glad I can remember the original APEC formulation. That's kind of part of the Mesolithic period of East Asian regionalism. Therese, a question up here at the front. This is my wife, Therese Rain. And so the question will be directed, hopefully, not at me.
Has to be at you.
I'm interested in what you think the low-hanging fruit might be for cooperation. Someone suggested Rohingya, but is that unplanned people movement? Is this a forum where people could collaborate? Or pandemics, for example, natural disasters like, I think, tsunami. Where do you think the low-hanging fruit is? I'm interested in everyone's thoughts on that.
In the latter basket, right? Kind of areas of practical kind of win-win cooperation, things like disaster planning, maritime rules, health issues. I think of the kinds of things that the organizations have worked on to date and could work on even more. That's fair?
Yeah, I think the most natural, the most high profile is natural disasters. Yeah. The tsunami in 2005, the earthquake and tsunami, the typhoons in the Philippines. It's one thing interesting about the response to natural disasters. Sometimes, until the U.S. Navy turns up, people actually are suffering. Having my previous lived in Malaysia and Indonesia during the tsunami and then subsequently, because only the U.S. has that capacity to go up. And within the East Asia Summit, we can, or any regional architecture, you can start having conversations that can even anticipate some of these disasters. In Singapore, we've actually set up, under the ADMM+, a regional humanitarian coordinating center, which puts militaries together that just have a regular exchange, that you can anticipate that there is going to be a disaster. You know it's going to happen regularly. It can just be the defense attaches based in Singapore that then can say, because every time you have a disaster, trying to get approvals to go in, we still respect national boundaries. Then you can pre-arrange some of these things. You can pre-position supplies in places. So natural disasters has been the most high profile, and I think pandemics are important, the way we've dealt with things like SARS and the avian flus coming in. Now I think areas like cybersecurity, where at minimum it should be capacity building, where countries like the US and Singapore that are fairly advanced on this, then working with the rest of the region, say, at least let's get some basic capacities up. We're not going there trying to point fingers and say, you are hacking into me or not. But let's get basic capacities up. Terrorism has been a new area that we need to start thinking about. We haven't quite got this into a regional context. But there are areas that we can start, at least from the low-hanging fruit, would be let's build capacity, let's build knowledge, and then when you do have a crisis, how do we respond to these things?
Just
depends on the United States, I guess.
The question asked was whether there is space also on climate change. I think the general posture on climate change will be that the negotiations are held globally for the simple reason that greenhouse gas emissions know no boundaries or know no regional boundaries. So I think that's the response there. But part of my response to Therese's question would be, one, to agree with the two colleagues about humanitarian disasters. We've been focused here on what's happened on the Florida Peninsula and earlier to that with Texas. And frankly, one of the consequences of long-term climate change is extreme weather events. We're beginning to see this globally. If you don't believe the climate change science, everyone who runs an insurance firm in the world believes it because the premiums have gone north in a big way. And they all have their climate change and climate monitoring units heavily underway, starting with AIG here, the biggest insurer in the world, and the rest. When you look at Asia, which is home to 3 to 4 billion people, look at maritime Asia, look at low-lying Asia in terms of the coastal areas of Bangladesh, look at how flat Ashok's country is. The Dutch and sort of dike building will have their next big growth industry in Singapore.
Already, yes.
Already. The bottom line is the exposure to human risk occasioned by natural disasters is not just going to be, if you look at the deep national security analysis, it's not going to be a marginal concern for the future, it'll be central. And so part of my reason for not being a dutiful husband and father in the last couple of years of my term in office, just explaining this to my wife, was that one of the things I was seeking to do was to negotiate the first EAS-wide protocol on natural disaster coordination, which began, I think, in 2010. And then since then, the pattern of all 18 states, from the PLA to the US Marines, regularly now participating in both desktop and physical counter natural disaster exercises, is now, frankly, one of the good things which is happening. And to conclude on that point, which you've just raised about counter-terrorism, I don't think we've all become conscious of what has now happened with ISIS in the Philippines. But ISIS in the Philippines is the harbinger of much to come, which will cause the question of the future of violent jihadism across Southeast Asia to become a central concern for what we do in this organisation, this institute, in terms of new areas of regional cooperation.
I want to before we finish up on the issue that the ambassador raises about cyber cooperation and capacity building and kind of the basics. I spent all last year chairing the President's Commission on Cybersecurity and delivered the report to President Obama in December and then briefed the Trump administration during the transition coming in the beginning of 2017. The capacity and the basics really matter on cybersecurity. There are a number of core steps that can be taken by a country or a company that will be 75 and 80% solutions, frankly. And it really is kind of low-hanging fruit, I think. We have the knowledge base. It's applied quite unevenly, even in the United States. It's really applied unevenly internationally. And it really is an important, I think, and really doable area for really productive cooperation.
Can I just add a little factoid on disaster assistance? They don't just happen in Asia. It's a little known fact that after Harvey hit, we have Chinook helicopters based in Texas, and they were operated with the Texas National Guard to provide disaster assistance. And the fact that we do train regularly together makes it so much easier for them to be able to offer that assistance almost immediately.
There you go, Singapore at work in Texas. You didn't think of that before this evening, did you? So thank you to the government of Singapore and for their fleet of Chinooks. And thank you, most importantly, given our time has come, to these two extraordinarily busy individuals to spend time with us here this evening. Both are based in Washington, D.C. Tom Donilon's had an extraordinary career so far of public service and a future one, I'm sure, as well. And Ambassador Mirpuri is one of the most senior diplomats in the Singaporean Foreign Service. Please bear in mind also the core recommendations of this report on the future of East Asian regional institutions and how we can sustain the long peace, whatever happens with North Korea. Please put your hands together to thank these two panelists. And an advertisement for us on North Korea itself. Where's Danny Russell? This coming Wednesday, Danny, up the back, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia at the State Department, now scholar in residence at the Asia Society Policy Institute.
Former member of the National Security Council.
Former member of the National Security Council, all-round good guy, Japan expert, serious American, serious citizen of the region.
Yeah.
And all those good things as well. Wednesday, what time, Danny?
8 a.m.
8 a.m. There'll be a gathering addressed by Danny on recent developments on North Korea, where to from here. He's just come back from quite a number of days in Seoul talking to the South Korean government about these questions. Thank you very much for your attendance tonight, and Godspeed and a safe return home to each of you.